From blurred images to detailed photographs of the universe, it gave us a whole new vision of the galaxies. From separate camera, internet and phone to having them in one device, it even changed the way we witness world events. From locked-in syndrome to operating a computer with just thoughts, it created a new way for paralyzed people to communicate. They were all inventions of the 1990s, a decade defined by biotech, computer tech, and a world gone wireless. The Hubble Telescope, the smartphone, and the Mars Pathfinder landing system were all inventions that shook the world. The first photos received from the world's most expensive telescope were blurred. What the camera required were some very clever eyeglasses, created by one ingenious space engineer. In 1993 in Garching, Germany, Jim Crocker's job had been a dream. He was the senior engineer on the Hubble Space Telescope project.
He wanted to help do whatever is necessary to get human beings into space, to explore the heavens. And Hubble was going to be exploring the heavens in a way that no one else had ever done it before.
For astronomers, looking at the stars had always been frustrating. It was similar to wearing spectacles with the wrong prescription.
It's fuzzy. It's out of focus. It's hard to see. The atmosphere blurs everything, and it makes things difficult to see sharply. And astronomers always complained about this. There's one astronomer who said, it would be great when I die to be sent, instead of heaven, to the moon and an observatory.
A way to overcome the problem was to get a telescope into space, free of the Earth's atmosphere. Construction of the Hubble Telescope began in 1970 and took 20 years. On the 24th of April 1990, NASA's Space Shuttle Discovery carried the 12-ton telescope up into space. 600 kilometers above the Earth, the Hubble began its circular orbit. Inside the telescope, a giant 2.5-meter mirror bounced light to a secondary one. That mirror focused the light further and fed it to 5 different devices. 2 cameras, the main one took huge pictures of whole galaxies. The other took telephoto images of single stars or planets. 2 spectrometers that converted the heat given off by distant objects into visible images. And 1 light meter that set the exposure on the other 4 devices. Back on Earth, everybody waited for the first fabulous photos to arrive. No one was more excited than Jim Crocker.
He'd be in the room when they got that first look at those stars and galaxies with glasses on, and that really was something appealing.
But when the first images began to arrive, everybody's hopes were shattered. They were fuzzy and indistinct, anything but sharp.
They were blur. They weren't seeing anything. It was junk. It was garbage. They didn't have a focused telescope. And no matter how much the engineers adjusted the primary mirror, they could not get focus. And this went on for 1 week, for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. They're going crazy. They cannot figure out why the telescope will not focus.
Jim Crocker's dream job had just turned into a nightmare. He met with other world experts in Germany to try to find out what the problem was with the telescope. It was a disaster. The experts discovered that the giant primary mirror for the Hubble wasn't built properly. The mirror's curve was at the wrong angle, just enough to mean every image would be out of focus.
This was probably the greatest possible disaster you could imagine for American astronomy. It was a pretty embarrassing failure, to be honest.
But what was worse was because the Hubble was in space, the mirror could not be repaired. A solution had to be found elsewhere.
That if you could put mirrors in the light paths between the primary mirror and the instruments themselves, you could correct the prescription and fix the problem. But no one could come up with a way to get those mirrors into the light path.
Jim wanted to be the one who solved the problem. In an effort to freshen up, he decided to take a shower. And it was in the European style of shower where he suddenly came up with a great idea.
That shower head could slide up and down the bar, and then the shower head itself was on like an 8-inch long pivot. You could tilt it up, you could tilt it sideways, you could tilt it in 360-degree angles.
Jim thought, would it be possible to put a device into the telescope that had arms which pivoted, similar to the shower, that could move the mirrors into place? Jim and his crew spent 3 years building CoStar, the unit that would hopefully refocus the astronomy instruments. CoStar was a big box, the size of a freezer and 3 times as heavy. Inside were 12 mirrors mounted on robotic arms. They would work similar to adjustable contact lenses for the instruments in the Hubble. In December 1993, a NASA space shuttle took CoStar up to the orbiting telescope. It took 5 spacewalks over 5 days to complete the installation.
No mission ever by any nation had attempted to do this many spacewalks in such a condensed period of time. So it was one of the most challenging missions ever planned up until that moment.
Back on Earth, 2 weeks later, the astronomers waited for the first images to arrive. The whole Hubble mission was resting on them.
There's so much at stake, and the drama is so high. Everyone knows the possibility of being able to see the heavens sharply hinges on this repair.
The images arrived, and they were sharp and crisp. They were perfect.
The reaction of the scientists was a mixture of unmitigated joy, unmeasurable relief that this was fixed and the telescope was now going to function as planned.
The Hubble Telescope has traveled more than 2.4 billion kilometers in over 20 years. In that time, astronomers have made hundreds of thousands of observations of the stars and galaxies. And, without doubt, the view and understanding of the universe is much clearer thanks to Jim Crocker and his clever CoStar. Other inventions of the decade. 1991, the World Wide Web, a giant pool of human knowledge, suddenly became available as the web took the internet out of institutions and into the home. That same year, the webcam, invented by some clever Cambridge students so they could monitor the coffee supply in another room, now built into almost every computer on the planet. 1996, genetic cloning. Dolly the sheep was a carbon copy of her mother and raised alarms. If sheep could be cloned, would humans be far behind? If a spacecraft were to journey to Mars, how would it land? Remarkably, by bouncing it inside a huge airbag. It was an incredibly risky idea, but one that worked. All because one junior space engineer knew a good idea when he saw it. In 1992, at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, 24-year-old Tom Rivellini had been asked to lead a team for a very difficult assignment. NASA wanted to send an exploratory mission to Mars, but it had to be done on an extremely tight budget. At the time, US taxpayers were fed up with the space agency. There was the Challenger disaster in 1986, and then there were the costly repairs on the almost new Hubble Telescope. But NASA had one very important ally, President Clinton.
We are committed to the aggressive plan we have put in place for robotic exploration of Mars.
The mission was called the Mars Pathfinder. A spacecraft would deliver a lander to Mars. Inside would be a free-ranging robotic rover called Sojourner that would roam the surface of the planet, collecting scientific data. The problem was, nobody knew how to land the lander. That incredibly difficult task had been given to Rivellini and his team. Even as a child, Rivellini wanted to be an engineer, in a reverse sort of way.
I was the classic kid who just takes everything apart. My mom had to hide, the toaster and the things that she didn't want taken apart. She put them on the top shelf so that I wouldn't take them apart.
There was a world of difference from dismantling toasters to the complexity of the landing project. Trying to touch down a spacecraft on Mars was a very dangerous proposition. The first challenge was the red planet's thin atmosphere.
The atmosphere is so thin that it's not enough to get you to land safely on the surface with just a parachute.
Also, the Pathfinder would be traveling through space at more than 27,000 kilometers an hour, and unless slowed, it would crash.
There's rocks everywhere, there's sand dunes, there's mountains, there's hills, there's ravines, and it's like taking your laptop and throwing it out of an airplane, and it's got to land safely in a rock field. So you got to come up with ways of making that happen, and it's really hard.
After 3 months, the landing team had not suggested any ideas to overcome the problems. Until one day, Rivellini saw something that inspired him. An old sketch from the 1960s of some weird-looking airbags. He thought, maybe this could be how to land the Pathfinder on Mars.
So I started flipping it open, and I see this really, really relevant stuff. It was really cool.
When Rivellini announced the idea to his team, it sounded completely crazy.
We're going to take Pathfinder and drop it on the surface of Mars and let it bounce like a rubber ball.
But would NASA gamble on such a risky idea?
We put in a proposal to headquarters, and it got selected. And that was a very big day for everybody, because up until that point, it was just an idea. It was just a technology task where we developed these prototype airbags. But at that point, it was actually the green light. Hey, we're going to Mars.
The entire NASA team developed a 4-step plan for landing safely on Mars. Step 1. As the lander sped towards the surface of the planet, a parachute would open.
So we're still traveling faster than the speed of sound. We pop open this parachute, and it's a very violent event.
The parachute would slow the lander, but only to 300 kilometers an hour. The next step, 2. Inflate the airbags. Then step 3. Set off 3 rear-facing deceleration rockets.
Literally 20, 30 meters from the surface, we light these rockets off, starting off at 200 miles an hour. And again, we was slamming on the brakes. We'd slow down from 200 miles an hour, basically to a dead stop, 8, 10 meters above the surface.
Then the final step. The lander would drop and bounce along the surface. It was the riskiest part of the landing, which Rivellini and his team had to design and perfect. They developed a shape quite quickly that would not put too much stress on the outer surface of the airbags.
You can imagine a soccer ball, and all the patches, instead of being flat and smooth on the surface, actually bulge out and are curved. So you can inflate it to a higher pressure, or you can use thinner fabrics or thinner materials.
The type of material to use was the next challenge for the team. Rivellini knew the thin nylon of car airbags would never be tough enough.
Because they basically have to push against your face, so your face isn't going to tear the airbag. On Mars, on the other hand, we're smashing into the ground and basically at freeway speeds against sharp rocks and hills and all sorts of uncontrolled surfaces. We had no idea that the abrasion layer was going to be so hard to figure out.
Rivellini and his team tried all types of materials with little success. But then they found one that seemed as if it could succeed, called Vectran.
Fantastic material, very similar to Kevlar, except its flexing properties were much, much better. It was much more capable of dealing with repeated folding and bending without breaking and getting weaker.
However, when the team subjected several Vectran models to a grueling set of tests, every single time the results were disastrous.
It was a terrible, terrible thing. It just shredded our airbags like they weren't even there. All of our different concepts, none of them work.
Time was running out. Although there was still a year before the launch, it would take most of that time to build and test a new set of airbags. And the launch date was immovable. The rocket would only have enough energy to reach Mars during a certain 2-week launch window, when the Earth and Mars were as close together as possible. This only occurred once every 2 years.
Okay, nothing's working. You guys go to lunch.
My project manager, every time I went up, he put his arm around me. Rivellini, the whole project's riding on those airbags. You got to make them work.
No matter how thick the layers of Vectran were, the airbags failed the tests every time.
We had not successfully executed a test from day one. We'd never seen a perfectly successful airbag drop test, period.
Rivellini then began to think back to the airbags that were failures. Some of them actually performed better than others. Thinking further, he realized which ones they were.
It was the ones where we had more layers. Didn't matter how heavy-duty the layers were, the ones that had more layers did better.
Rivellini's team built a new set of airbags as fast as they could. This time, they used 5 thin layers of Vectran. They then had to pass a crucial drop test. There were only 2 months before the airbags had to be delivered for the launch.
4 seconds.
If the airbags failed, the whole mission was
1
off.
second. Release.
They passed, with no rips in them at all.
Good job, folks.
Mars Pathfinder was launched on the 4th of December, 1996.
And liftoff of the Delta rocket with Mars Pathfinder.
It traveled through space for 7 months and almost 500 million kilometers. On the 4th of July, 1997, the Pathfinder was due to land on Mars. The whole team gathered in the control room and waited. Rivellini and the airbag team were about to live through 6 minutes of terror.
It's both a chain of things that have to happen and a chain of people making all of those things happen. And literally, if any one of those links in the chain doesn't work, the whole mission just fails, it dies. And the airbag technology really was one of the very last links in that chain.
There were no visual indications of the progress. only special tones to inform the team whether each stage of the landing was successful or not. The first few tones were heard. But until Rivellini heard the special tone notifying him that the lander had bounced to a stop, the whole mission was still in jeopardy. Finally, it arrived. The landing was a success.
It was just a tremendous sense of joy, accomplishment, and satisfaction all kind of rolled into one. And it was one of the best days of my career. It really was.
The Sojourner rolled off the lander the next day and signaled in an era of Mars exploration. In just 3 months, Pathfinder returned an unprecedented amount of data. Both the lander and the rover kept working longer than anyone had expected. But the Mars Pathfinder mission would never have landed in the first place if it hadn't been for the brilliance and persistence of Tom Rivellini and his airbag team. Other inventions of the decade. 1997, Deep Blue. Along came the IBM machine that finally confounded chess genius Garry Kasparov. He only won 1 game out of 6 and wasn't best pleased.
And I don't think this machine is unbeatable.
That same year, the MP3 player. Music files could be transferred through cyberspace. Who knew thousands of songs could fit into something this small? Now, even those people who can't afford electricity need never be cut off from news or emergency alerts. Thanks to a radio that runs on muscle power, not plugs, not batteries. All because of a British engineer with a heart who never threw anything away. One afternoon in 1991, Trevor Bayliss turned on the telly and found himself watching a documentary about the spread of AIDS in Africa.
They said the only way they could stop this dreadful disease cutting its way through Africa and many other places was with the power of radio or communication. Most of Africa didn't have electricity, and the only other form of electricity was in the form of batteries, which were horrendously expensive.
Like many people, Trevor wanted to help, but unlike most, he could possibly do something about it. There wasn't much this man couldn't do. He had been a national champion swimmer, an acrobat, and even a stuntman. But he was also an engineer who had designed a whole range of special devices for people with disabilities.
I don't invent things simply only because of the money, you know. It's very often about the need, and need is the thing that tends to push me.
Trevor wanted to give the people of Africa a way of getting the information they needed. He began to picture a radio he could build for them that would not cost a penny to run.
I'm thinking of my old gramophone with a handle on it, and I'm thinking to myself, look, if you can get all that noise by dragging a rusty nail around a piece of old Bakelite using a spring, surely there's enough power in that spring to drive a radio. Voila.
He had the perfect place to build a prototype, his workshop, full of recycled junk.
I don't discard anything. I know it sounds daft, but if there's room for it, I'll keep it, you know. But it's part of my persona, I guess.
Trevor began with an old transistor radio that was in his workshop. Next, he needed to find a power source. Batteries weren't allowed, but a dynamo might do. A dynamo is an electric motor run in reverse. If the mechanism inside is turned, electricity comes out of it. The best example is headlights on a bicycle. Pedaling the bike produces the power for the lights. Trevor soon had the dynamo connected to the transistor radio. He then used a hand drill to turn the dynamo. A temporary measure until he could design a crank to turn it. What he heard from his inventions was music to his ears.
By the time I found the solder and all the other bits and bobs, the wires, and actually did the work, half-hour top whack is what it took me to prove that my idea was a reality.
Finally, all Trevor needed was a spring, one that would store the power once he had cranked the radio. The same sort of power a watch has after it's been wound. He had lots of springs, but he needed a constant fourth spring so his radio would run smoothly. Trevor was stumped, but not for long.
Just by chance, when I was climbing in the car, I put my seatbelt on. I thought, hang on, constant force. So I went to the breaker's yard and managed to get a constant force spring from them. Boom, boom.
The seatbelt spring meant Trevor had completed his prototype wind-up radio. Crank it for 30 seconds, and it played for 14 minutes. He just had to get the radio into production, which was, of course, the toughest part. For 3 years, Trevor had nothing but rejections from potential investors.
By this time I got the patent in hand, I went to everybody you could think of, right? And they all said no.
Many inventors would have given up at this point, but the former daredevil showman had a bold idea. Phone the BBC and tell them how his wind-up radio could be a breakthrough invention for Africa. And the BBC bit.
Ironically, I went to the BBC World Service and they loved it. And then they passed me on to the BBC Tomorrow's World team. And of course, they did a number and woof, it really did go like clockwork in the sense that everybody went wild for it.
So you think there really is a market?
I think there's a tremendous market if it's marketed at an affordable price.
2 investors saw the show and leapt at the chance to invest. Together with them, Trevor set up a company in Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh, it's like live, mate. Oh, it's terrific.
Soon, his radios were rolling off the factory production line. Finally, Trevor received the recognition he deserved. He was honored with an Order of the British Empire and a big thank you from his hero, Nelson Mandela. But his greatest pleasure was seeing his invention being used where it was needed.
When you see people out there dancing and leaping around because this is the first radio they've been able to have, and the fact that they didn't need a power line coming in from Ethiopia in order to run the thing. I mean, you know, it's a great honor, great privilege.
Thanks to inventor Trevor Bayliss, millions of people around the world are better informed. Point it, shoot it, share it. We can now live in the moment, all because of the camera that's always with us. And the first big step to creating it is thanks to a software geek who did his best work while under pressure.
I'm Philippe Khan. My wife is in labor.
Yes, right this way.
Thank you.
At a hospital in Santa Cruz in June 1997, Philippe Khan was rushing for the most important appointment of his life, the birth of his first baby. Philippe is known for first throughout the computer world. His speciality was making devices work together. He was a software engineer who worked out how to synchronize personal digital assistants with computers. Philippe may be a genius in the computer world, but he was totally out of his depth in the maternity ward.
Just go.
We had been to the Lamaze classes and all these type of things, and the classic thing happens, you know, you say, okay, breathe, relax, and immediately Sonia turns to me, why don't you mind your own business and do your thing? I know what I'm doing.
Philippe camped out in the waiting room, where he unloaded all the latest technology. A digital camera, mobile phone, and a laptop computer. He was planning to announce the birth of his baby to everyone he knew.
You know, we figure out that we do what people do, which is send an email saying Sophie is born, she's 5 pounds 6, whatever she's saying, and she's in good health and all that. That's what we were planning to do. And then suddenly I said, oh, maybe I could do better.
Philippe decided to make a bigger announcement by taking a photograph of the new baby and sending it along with the email. But there was one slight problem. At the time, wireless internet in public places didn't exist, and he couldn't find a phone socket anywhere for his computer.
Hello? Oh, hi, Grandma.
And he also made a promise that he may not be able to keep.
I'll get you the photo. I promise. All right, bye.
Philippe became hooked on announcing the birth instantly, and then he had an idea. Although his mobile phone couldn't connect to the internet, it did run on a cellular network, which was wireless. He thought that he could send the photo through his phone to a website on his computer at home that was permanently connected to the internet.
And the whole idea was to be able to take a picture, create a link on a website wirelessly, upload the picture, and then send automatically emails to about 2,000 people who were on my mailing list.
Sonia?
It was crazy to think Philippe could make his new technology work in time for the birth, but that's never stopped him previously. The first stage was to write the computer program into his laptop that would tell his phone how to send the photos through the cellular network.
The key is software. You got to build software. So it's a little bit embedded software that talks low level. And then the software, the server software really, that is able to take that picture, put it automatically on a website at the time, and then generate those links dynamically and send emails, you know, to my whole list automatically so that they receive an email. It tells them, you know, Philippe sent you a picture of the birth of Sophie who was blah, 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 blah. You know, click on this hot link and it'll get you to the picture.
The next stage was to be able to connect all 3 devices to one another: the camera, computer, and mobile phone. Philippe then began the fastest soldering job of his life. He was cutting it fine.
Mr. Khan, it's time.
It had been 18 hours of hard labor, but Sonia and baby Sophie were ready to test Philippe's invention. He took a photo and liked what he saw. He then hurried to send the picture using his phone. First, he transferred the photo to his laptop computer, as he always did. Then, with the phone connected to his laptop, he ran the new program which loaded the photo and the email announcement into his phone. His phone sent them through the cellular network to his computer at home. The home computer was programmed to automatically send out the email which contained a link to the photo. Philippe waited anxiously to see if his new system worked.
Hello? Grandma, you got it? Yeah. She's beautiful. Yeah.
That day, fundamentally, 2 things were born. I mean, Sophie, which is really important, and probably the camera phone, and so she's the camera phone baby.
Philippe's camera phone was a clunky predecessor to the sleek devices of today, but it caused a lot of geek envy at the time.
Many times you do these things, you're not sure what you're really creating. And then people, and this is exactly what happened, because what happened is that once 2,000 people got the picture of the birth, I'm going forward and the thing, I get these emails back, say, how do you do that? We can see you're doing that in real time. Wow, this is cool, can I have one?
Today, the camera phone is one of the most popular gadgets on the planet. Anyone can take and send photos or videos instantly to any place in the world. They can do it because technology genius Philippe Kahn is one very determined man. Other inventions of the decade. 1998, the stem cell, a multi-purpose lifesaver. It can transform itself into any other kind of cell to repair damaged parts of the body. Also that same year, the BlackBerry, a computer-type phone with an easy-to-use thumb keyboard. Man and machine as one. Once only a dream, but it is now possible for those patients paralyzed to be able to control computers. Thanks to an Irish neuroscientist with a brilliant idea. In 1997, at Emory University Hospital in Georgia, Philip Kennedy was examining Johnny Ray for the first time.
You squeeze tight.
Johnny had had a stroke that had left him paralyzed. His brain was working normally, but his brain stem was dead, and it no longer carried information from his brain to the rest of his body. He had what is known as locked-in syndrome.
Patient unresponsive.
Johnny couldn't move. He couldn't speak. All he could do was blink. He was trapped in his own body.
Locked-in syndrome is when an individual cannot move, cannot speak, but they're alert and intelligent.
Kennedy had been trying to help patients suffering from locked-in syndrome for the previous 30 years. When he was a medical student, he had met a polio victim that changed his life.
He was totally bright, awake, alert, smart guy, couldn't move. I found it very traumatic, and I think that's actually put a little bug in the back of my brain somewhere, you know, to help that guy and people like him.
Kennedy thought that the worst part of being locked in had to be the inability to communicate. He knew that Johnny's brain still worked, so he wondered if he could teach Johnny to control a computer with just his thoughts. First, he had to be able to connect with Johnny's brain. Kennedy designed a special hollow glass device that would accomplish two things. One, once it was planted into Johnny's brain, new nerve tissue would grow through it. Two, wires inside the device would then conduct signals from the new nerve tissue to a recorder outside Johnny's brain. Kennedy called his invention the Neuro Trophic Electrode, but would it work? Kennedy began experimenting with rats in his lab, implanting his new electrodes into their brains.
The surgery had to be developed, and it was done under the microscope, so that makes it more difficult. It had to be good with your hands. But everything I used was biocompatible, so I didn't think it would be rejected.
After 1 week, he checked on the rats. New nerve tissue had grown through the hollow electrode, and it was sending signals to Kennedy's computer. The first step of his experiment was a success.
After I studied the rats and realized that this electrode was working, I was absolutely delighted. I knew that I just had to keep going, no matter what.
After a lot of careful development, Kennedy was ready to implant his electrode into a human brain. But first, he needed permission from the most important person.
Hello, Johnny. My name is Dr. Philip Kennedy. We may have a way to help you communicate again. It's a new procedure. It involves a brain-computer interface. Would you be willing to give the neural connector a go?
1 blink meant no, but 2 meant yes.
Good man.
Johnny was a very brave guy, and he knew that it might never do him any good per se, but he knew that at least he would be part of an attempt to make that connection.
On the 5th of August 1997, Johnny was wheeled down to surgery. Philip Kennedy was incredibly anxious.
It's a huge amount on the line. If we made a mistake at that point, him having seizures, having a bleed into his head or something, that would probably end the whole research.
In the operating room, the surgical team implanted one of Kennedy's electrodes into Johnny's motor cortex, the part of the brain that controls body movement. Johnny made it through the surgery with no problems at all.
While we're waiting a few weeks before recording, the brain is very busy growing neurites, little processes, into this tiny container.
You can see quite a bit of
It took 2 weeks for the new nerve tissue to grow through the electrode in Johnny's brain, but it was sending out signals.
That's very encouraging.
Kennedy and his team began to record the signals. Kennedy then used a computer program he had created to turn those signals into commands the computer could understand. Kennedy and his star pupil were ready for their first test. It was a big moment, as it would tell Kennedy whether his invention actually worked.
Johnny, now think about moving your arm.
Johnny followed the order. When he thought about moving his arm, his thoughts would trigger signals from the new nerve in his motor cortex. Then the electrode would transmit those signals to Kennedy's computer. The computer was programmed to interpret the signals as a command to move the cursor on the screen. Kennedy held his breath. The cursor moved. His electrode was doing exactly what it had been designed to do.
Very good.
Then he had, like you would have with your mouse, you can move it across and down or all around the screen. And so once you have that, then all you need is a click. So we provided that from a little muscle activity on the side of his neck.
Soon, Johnny was spelling out words on the computer. One day, he even surprised the great inventor.
So he spelled my name. At that point, that was the eureka moment. I said, this guy has control of his computer now.
Kennedy is now trying to use his neurotrophic electrode to restore actual speech.
We asked ALS patients if they wanted restoration of their hand movement or speech. And of course, it's always speech, because that's so much more direct. And if you can speak, you can control a computer. And you control your environment, interact with people at a much more natural level.
Philip Kennedy has done more to open doors for the locked in than just about anyone else.